and then we'll have Ibrahim Fakir responding. After that, I will open with 1 or 2 questions, and then we will open to anyone who can send us questions, I think either via the chat, or I think the Afrobarometer team will advise us how to move forward on that. But let's start, because time is money and we have a lot of data to get through. I just want to give you a brief kind of overview. Firstly, Jan is a socio-political analyst and strategic foresight professional. He heads the research and policy program here at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, and is also the core partner director for the implementation of Afrobarometer's work in Southern Africa. Again, good afternoon, Jan. And then I have the great pleasure of also just introducing my friend and longtime brother from another mother, Ibrahim Fakir, who of course has more than 25 years of experience in the political and governance sector, and is currently a consultant at ASA, where he previously headed the Governance, Institutions and Process Program during 2009-2016. He was awarded the Ruth First Fellowship in 2014 at Wits University, and has also been a visiting fellow at the University of Sussex and a Draper Hill's Summer Fellow at Stanford University. He also writes extensively, and his insights always welcome and a talking point here in South Africa. He writes on politics and development in not only local media, but also international and academic journals. Good afternoon, Ibrahim. Thank you, and I will hand over to Jan for the start of the survey results. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crystal. As we just proceed to the survey itself. Oops, my apologies. All right. Good. So as indicated earlier, this is a telephonic survey that we have done during April and May, conducted by the Afrobarometer on behalf and the IJR as its regional core partner. So to jump right into it, a number of key findings that stand out for us from this survey. Firstly, South Africans are unhappy with the way in which our democratic system responds to the real needs of its citizens. It does not mean that they reject democracy, but they reject the way in which it is functioning. And therefore, it's just not surprising that fewer than half of South Africans also feel close to a political party in the run-up to this election. Close to 1/3 of South Africans who are registered and intending to vote are still uncertain about the party that they will vote for on the 29th of May. So if you have come here to have a clear and accurate prediction of how our election is likely to turn out on the 29th of May, you might have come to the wrong place. But we will share with you some of the reasons why we think that much is still in the air and that there are still many permutations that can materialize over the next week. But before we do that, just a brief overview of what Afrobarometer is. It's a Pan-African non-partisan research network with the goal to amplify the voices of Africans in policy and decision-making processes across the continent. It conducts surveys in waves or rounds, and we're currently in round 10 of the survey, and it's currently underway. This particular telephone survey does not form part of a specific round, but represents a study into the pre- and post-election environment in South Africa in 2024. This is just a brief overview of where we have been conducting Afrobarometer surveys. Since 1999, you see those countries colored in dark red or brownish color are the ones that we've started with, and those in the light bluish color are the ones that we will be introducing in the 10th round of the survey. about this particular survey, something more. So this is, for us, a first. It's the first publicly released Afrobarometer telephone survey probing the views and opinions of a representative sample of South Africans. Our brand at Afrobarometer up till now has been specifically focusing on face-to-face interviews, but also given the short run prior to the elections, we have been working also in this regard with a telephone survey. The survey was conducted between 23 April and the 11th of May, and respondents were selected from a database of 14 million mobile phone numbers. Importantly, this survey also forms part of a broader panel study with a second survey that we will be completing after the election, where we will be reaching out to the same respondents that have participated in the survey. And also just to note to say on our methodology and specifically the use of telephones, this database was compliant with the Protection of Personal Information Act, and respondents were also given the options to decline to participate or opt out of this database. Shortly, just a few words on the methodology. We've got a sample size of 1,800 adult South Africans aged 18 and above. It's a representative sample with the respondents selected according to age, race, gender, province, and urban and rural location. And our estimated margin of sampling error is plus minus 2.3 percentage points, meaning that when we make a finding, we allow for a room of error of about 2.3% to either side. And this is just the survey demographics that I've referred to briefly for you to have a look at, also to just explain the extent to which we have gone to make this a truly representative survey of adult South Africans. Right, so now we're moving into the findings of this specific survey. The first section deals with a few key insights of how South Africans are experiencing living in South Africa today. So the first important insight that we will get from this particular section and that you can look out for is growing dissatisfaction with the general direction that the country is moving. And secondly, not surprisingly, they regard unemployment, electricity provision, and corruption as the three most intractable problems that we face as a country. And here you see the graph with regard to the overall direction of the country. Around 85% of South Africans indicating that they are not happy with the direction that the country is taking, about 13% indicating that it's going in the right direction. So this finding with regard to the overall direction of the country is not something that has happened overnight. I think if we look at the next graph, you can see that there has been an overall sort of incremental upward trajectory over the years in the percentage of South Africans feeling that the country is not going in the right direction. If you look at our finding in 2011, that was around 46% indicating we're going in the wrong direction, with an equal percentage, or same percentage, saying that we're going in the right direction. If we look at 2024, there we see the 85% going in the wrong direction and 13% in the right direction. So a substantial change of about 40% over time. Looking at the most important problems, and I think this graph also does not provide any surprises for most of you, the most important intractable problems that we face with, that we face up to as a country. Firstly, unemployment. Secondly, a question of load shedding and the knock-on effects that have on our society. Question of corruption. The cost of living and so forth, poverty, inequality, and so forth. I think an interesting entry also in this year's list of most intractable problems is the question of water supply that we're also increasingly seeing along the problems that we were experiencing with electricity. And just quickly sort of also reflecting on the most intractable problem that has been highlighted by South Africans since the introduction of the quarterly labor force survey in 2008. Unemployment in its conservative definition has increased by close to 10% from 23% to 33%. But during this period, the percentage of employed South Africans as a percentage of the total working age population has also shrunk from 46% to 41%, meaning more than 1 in 2 South Africans do not work, which is it's a statistic that really is cause for concern, because it also have an impact on a number of other issues in our society that relates to the questions of agency. Now, moving on to the question of agency, we look at the perceptions that South Africans have about democracy, because the problems that we have just sort of looked at are all mediated by a particular political system and its institutions. And here we are going to look at the system that mediates these different areas that facilitate delivery in our economy. Firstly, in our perceptions of democracy section, you can look out for the following key findings. There's a broadly shared sentiment that democracy is not functioning as it should. And this is a view that cuts across race, age, location, and education categories. While a majority is dissatisfied with the substantive day-to-day functioning of democracy, a majority still anticipate that our elections will be free and fair. On the 29th, with a minority of about 11% anticipating that it will not be the case. This majority of people who anticipate that it will be free and fair does, however, mark a decline over time. And we've seen a shrinkage also in the number or percentage of South Africans believing that their elections are free and fair. So moving to the first slide in this section, the satisfaction with democracy. The question that we've asked overall, how satisfied are you with the way democracy is working in South Africa? There we see 62% have indicated they're not very happy or they're not at all happy, compared to the 36% who said that they're fairly satisfied or very satisfied. Again, this is a picture that has evolved over time. When we asked the same question in 2011, only about 39% indicated that they are not happy with the way things are working, compared to the 62% that we've seen in this latest survey, incremental increases over time that we see here. We look at the next graph and we provide a breakdown of how different demographic groups respond to this. We see that this is a view that is held widely and shared across different educational sort of categories, age categories, rural, urban, and gender categories. Moving on to the question of expectations of freeness and fairness of the elections. Here we see 38% indicate that it will be completely free and fair, while another 30% indicating it will be free and fair with minor problems. And then moving down, about 15% indicating free and fair, but with major problems. And then that 11% will indicate that it will not be free and fair. Again, seeing or looking at the picture over time, the purple bar indicating the extent to which people believe our elections will be free and fair or have been free and fair. In the instance of previous elections, percentage going down from 52% in 2011 till the 38% in 2024. So then looking at participation of South Africans in elections, having just also looked at the question of freeness and fairness in the previous slide, So key insights from this section. 86% of respondents indicated that they are registered to vote for the elections on the 29th. 90% of those who indicated that they have registered indicated their intention to vote. And about 68% of those who registered and intend to vote have already made up their mind about their voting intention. That means about 32% said that they have not made up their mind on how they will vote on the 29th. This is just a question where we've asked respondents whether they have participated and voted in the previous election. Here, about 73% of our respondents indicated that they have voted. Now, moving on to the intention for 2024. Again, we show about 86% of our respondents indicated that they have registered to vote. And then when we provide the breakdown of those who indicated that they have registered to vote, about 88% indicated that they are likely to vote. 6% said they're unlikely, and about 7% said that they don't know yet. Of course, this registered response or response amongst respondents that they have registered is somewhat higher than the statistic provided by the ISC. We also anticipate here that there could have been some kind of desirability effect, that people might have indicated or felt that it is desirable to respond in this way, or it could also potentially stem from ignorance of people thinking that they are registered to vote, but not. So we have then we've asked people who have registered to vote and who have indicated that they're likely to vote, whether they have already decided which party they will vote for. And as indicated earlier, about 68% said that they have already made a choice. About 25% said no, they have not made up their mind yet. And another 7% indicated that they do not sort of want to share their view on this question. Moving on to the next section on electoral changes. So in recent years, the country has witnessed amendments to its electoral law, which amongst other things means the introduction of a third ballot, which also allows for the election of independents, both at the national and the provincial level. But apart from that, the political landscape has also shifted with real possibility that we may end up with some form of coalition government after the election. So we've attempted to probe the public's responses to these changes in the landscape. So in terms of the introduction of independent candidates, just under half of South Africans feel that it's a positive reform, while a quarter disapproved of it. And about 45% approved of the potential forming of a governing coalition, although a substantial minority of about 28% also indicated that they disapprove of this. Here, just an overview on the response for independent candidates. Also an indication here that the views cut across our different sort of demographic categories, no real standout, except maybe for respondents with no formal education, where 40% indicated that they approve compared to others that are closer to 50%. Looking at the approval for multi-party coalitions, the finding at about 45% approve or strongly approve of the formation of coalitions, but 28% disapproving, and 23% indicating that they neither approve or disapprove, meaning that they have not really formed a clear opinion on this. Generally, again, across the demographic categories, sort of broad consensus around the sort of approval of multi-party coalitions. Again, the only standout statistic there is for post-secondary respondents, with about 54% showing approval, which is higher than those for other particular education categories. And so we move on to political party support, the question I think that many of us have on our lips, which way it is going. And as indicated earlier, we'll have to disappoint you without being able to give you a clear indication of what we would predict that would be. So the the key insights in this particular section: close to half of South Africans, or 47%, do not feel close to any political party. We can ask about voting intentions, but there are critical caveats to consider when interpreting the results, whether we are talking about all respondents, only registered voters, or only likely voters. And in the next slides that you will see, is roughly 1/3 of respondents say that they don't know which party they will vote for on the 29th. So in short, there are many, even among those who intend to vote, who have not expressed a party preference. And given this high undecided component, it's not really possible for us to make a conclusive call about the likely electoral outcome and these results. So just moving on to the question of closeness to a political party. And the question that we repeat in successive rounds of the Afrobarometer survey to see the attachment that people have to political parties is, do you feel close to any political party? A simple question that we ask our respondents. And you will see that the percentage of people who have indicated that they feel close to a political party, in other words, the yellow bar right there in the middle, have substantially shrunk over time in South Africa. In 2011, about 61% of our respondents said they feel close to a political party. By 2024, that figure is 46%. Those who indicated that they do not feel close to the political party is 47%, and we also see the balance indicating that they do not want to respond to that particular question. So what we see over time, a decline in party loyalty, meaning that South African political parties, to a lesser extent over the years, can rely on the loyalty of voters to support them. So we now move on to the next slide in this section, and this is, who are the parties that voters feel close to? So of that particular 46% who have indicated that they feel close to a political party, which are those parties? And so we see here that the ANC is still by a large margin the biggest beneficiary of party loyalty. About 34% of those indicated that they are close to a political party are ANC supporters. So that is support that the party can already bank prior to the election. For the DA, the corresponding figure is 13%, the EFF 10%, and interestingly, for a newcomer that does not really have a track record yet, the MK party already has a loyalty of about 10%. You'll see also a substantial figure of our respondents indicating that they refuse to respond to this particular question. So now moving on to the actual results on when we have asked people their voting intention. And you will see in the way that we present it, there are basically two models that we will represent to you. And this will also indicate the complexity of making a call on the outcome. So, voting intentions, and here we look at all responses from our respondents. When all responses are included, including responses from voters who do not say which party they will vote for, support for the ANC ranges from 20% among all respondents to 25% amongst likely voters. Support for the DA ranges from 10 to 12%, and EFF and MK 6 to 7%. So you may ask, these percentages are much lower than the polls that you've seen before. And the reason why this is the case is that in our specific slide here, what we do is we include those respondents who have indicated that they don't know what they are going to vote or will not vote. Most of the other surveys that have been published excludes those, and of course pushes up percentages. But let's just look at this particular slide, which are for South Africans, all our respondents, and including the don't know and will not vote responses. So you'll see 3 bars for each party. The first represents those who indicated their voting preference. So those are everyone in our sample. The second one are for registered voters, and the third one, which I think is the one that we need to pay attention to here, is registered voters and those who indicated that they are likely to vote. So in that particular bar, which is the third part or the third bar, the ANC gets about 25, DA 12, the EFF 7, MK 7, and other parties 14. And we see that very high level of don't knows, undecided voters. So many other surveys, as I mentioned, report their findings on voting intentions with a don't know and similar responses excluded from their reporting. So if we exclude don't know and the will not vote responses, the ANC share increases to between 36% of all respondents and 39% of respondents who are likely to vote. However, we do not know how the undecided voters will break, so we cannot really predict the final election outcome. So this is just our breakdown again here, but in this instance, excluding voters who indicated that they don't know and will not vote. In the first light blue bar, we've indicated voting preference if the election is tomorrow for all South Africans surveyed. The second one for those South Africans who are registered. And the third is for South Africans indicated that they have registered and they are likely to vote. And this is, I think, the result that is probably more comparable to those that have been recently released by Ipsos, Ipsos and Mark Data, etc. With the ANC, we're looking here at the dark blue bar at 39%, the DA at 19%, the EFF at 10%, MK at 10%, and other parties at 23%. This is how our breakdown looks if we present it in a rural-urban format, with the ANC performing much stronger sort of in rural areas than others. Also the case for MK and the EFF. Voting intention by gender, very similar for the different genders as well. So, in conclusion, South Africans continue to suffer under the burden of poverty and inequality and unemployment. In spite of some major gains in the first decade of democracy, progress seemed to have stalled over the past decade and a half. And for this reason, there has been growing satisfaction also with the way in which democracy has functioned in addressing this triple scourge. As a result, Turnout has also declined in successive elections amongst those who have not registered. A quarter has indicated that voting makes no difference to them. Almost half of South Africans do not feel close to a political party. And even among registered voters intending to vote, close to a third don't know who they will be voting for. And so in conclusion, this leaves open too many permutations to make any firm predictions from our side at this point. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jan, for a real substantive presentation on the survey results. I'm not even going to try to do justice and summarize some of your points, but I think ultimately, as you say, given what you've outlined against this backdrop, it would be absolutely premature to make any precise predictions, because I think as journalists, we all want to know what's the final, and thank you for that. And so now, Ibrahim Fakir, with your lens and your insights as a political analyst, as someone who has looked at elections quite closely, over to you for some of the pertinent issues that you think needs to be highlighted and your analysis. Thank you, Ibrahim Fakir.
Thanks very much, Crystal. I really appreciate your very kind introduction up front. I think people will know that you were that kind because we're friends. And it's also good to be among friends, Jan and Kate and all the team at the IJR. It's either very brave or quite silly of you to have invited me, who's a sort of virulent, anti-quantitative type person. But I'm not that. I mean, it just appears as if I'm brilliantly anti-quantitative. I'm not really. I've happily been working with data from Afrobarometer for quite a significant amount of time. And I've often used it in my analysis and in the kind of work that I've done. So with that, congratulations to you guys for turning out this so quickly. And secondly, congratulations for distinguishing yourselves from all of the other surveys or opinion polls, as I call them, which have come out. And I don't take the Afrobarometer as, as an opinion poll. I take it as a survey which is indicative of interesting trends and important trends in our political culture and our attitudes to political institutions, to political ideas, and to political parties themselves. So from that point of view, it's really both useful and interesting because it's just so different. The second is you know, you really do deserve significant credit for centering the voices of citizens, because all too often in the electoral process and much of the coverage of what has happened around the elections have been contestant-centric. They have been all about the political parties. The political parties have led the conversation. The political parties have identified the issues, and they've been allowed to, without any critical lens or engagement, been allowed to simply hold forth on the kind of issues and concerns and their priorities, basically, have become the defining issues around which the conversations have happened, rather than the conversations being led around the concerns of citizens who are, in fact, the primary actors in the political contest and in the electoral process. Because the elections are actually about citizens. The parties and the contestants, this type independents, are merely contestants in the process. So, you know, congratulations for centering the voice of citizens and making it about the citizen rather than the contestants. Not that the contestants are unimportant, because you're obviously talking about them at the end. And no one's saying that they shouldn't be featured or they shouldn't be important, but the reality is that this is one of the first things that has tried to kind of center the voices and the concerns and priorities of people rather than the concerns of citizens, and rather than the concerns of merely the contestants and so on. So on to the actual substantive findings of what's around and what we found. First is, I mean, it's unsurprising the attitude and the support for democracy, as it's called. But I'm starting to wonder whether it's dissatisfaction or unhappiness with democracy, or whether it's unhappiness with democratic governance. And I think some kind of conceptual distinction is necessary. And perhaps in future surveys, there need to be broader questions which fracture and fragment the kind of attitudes to democracy as a set of social practices in society, and democratic governance, which is about the use, instrumentalization, and administration of political power. And my suspicion, because I think it's true to say that South Africa's democracy as a set of social practices is pretty robust. No one can argue. Of course, perhaps the shack dwellers and a couple other movements might say that the strong arm of the state is often felt during protest action and so on. But by and large, fundamental freedoms are enjoyed. The voice and choice and the space for exercising voice and choice is pretty large and big. In fact, you can swear at the president if you like, and there are very little repercussions. You can protest, you can organize. So all of the fundamental freedoms are intact. One enjoys the rights and liberties which are enshrined in the Constitution. But often, when it comes to things around democratic governance, around oversight, transparency, accountability, restraints on power, constraints on the exercise of authority, I think that is literally where citizen dissatisfaction may be located. And so perhaps I think it would be interesting in future to fragment it from, separate it at least from democratic governance, and perhaps measure attitudes to both. And this is not to prolong and elongate the kind of survey needlessly, but perhaps there's some questions which are less important than I think these ones. Then on the intention to vote, again, I'm not frankly horribly surprised at the attitudes to the intention to vote, because along with your findings around turnout and the potential for what the turnout might be, and I'll return to that point a little later, there's a parallel between the previous Afrobarometer findings in 2021 around the trust in institutions and so on, with the declines in voter participation. And I don't think much of this is attributable either to disinterest or apathy or a non-political animus in the kind of political cultures. I think South Africa still remains a highly politicized culture. There's massive interest in politics, but perhaps not as much interest in political parties as distinct from political ideas, which is something I'll also come to towards the end of my presentation, and because you spoke about the affinity or closeness to parties. But on the question of this voting intention, I mean, I think it's unsurprising that when there is such major mistrust and declining levels of mistrust in public institutions, and also other interesting findings from previous rounds of Afrobarometer, where you ask, are politicians going to, or do you think the parties and institutions are solving the problems of the public? You don't get a terribly helpful or encouraging response, put it that way. And so it's unsurprising that people don't feel that they should participate when their trust in these institutions, who are meant to be institutions of public deliberation and problem solving, are not actually serving their purpose, which relates to a point that you find at the end around affinity, or the declining affinity or closeness to political parties. There's a closeness to political ideas, but not closeness to political parties. And it may be true that this decline in closeness is attributable to the fact that I think people are unable to discern what the parties actually stand for. Many parties now don't have a fidelity or commitment to a set of principles. So people are unsure, what am I signing up to here? So that's unsurprising. On the question, and this is my fifth point, around trust in the Electoral Commission, the freeness and the fairness of the election, and those numbers are also interesting but worrying, because I compared what you're finding here around the freeness and the fairness of the election to the previous round of Afrobarometer findings, which looked at the decline in the level of trust in the IEC. And there is a coincidence, a disappointing coincidence between the trash talking by politicians against the IEC and these sharp declines in trust, with the declines in trust that the elections are going to be free and fair, notwithstanding the kind of preparations and expertise that actually does reside in the IEC. So to me, it's unsurprising that there's this coincidence between the trash talking of the IEC by politicians with particular points in the electoral cycle. And you'll notice that this dip starts to happen, declines in trust in the IEC starts to happen around 2017, 2018. It is when even the governing party starts to trash talk the IEC. But there's a third element to this, and that element is around the increasing number of complaints against the IEC, some of them spurious, but some of them having a legitimate basis. So the administrative complaints, issues around management and logistics, the failure of the working of some of the IEC's equipment, the voter register devices, and so on, including the fact that in the last election, there were people who were meant to be on the voters' roll who were not, people who are not meant to be on the voters' roll who are. So effectively, some voters feeling they were disenfranchised and so on. So those kind of increasing numbers of complaints, increasing number of court cases, objections to the process, objections to the way in which administration has been handled, have also led to this kind of decline. But nevertheless, I do think that we will have overall what is a free and a fair election. So related to this, and tying this question of trust with the question of participation, voter intention, voter turnout, with the potential for what this turnout might look like. And I don't think anyone knows. You are hesitating, it appears, that there might be a spike in the voter turnout, or at least not a spike, but amongst registered voters, there is a firm intention to actually turn out. And that's not a bad thing. So we might well find that you will have a high or a spike in turnout, higher than we expect, perhaps not as high as it used to be, but higher than it was in the last election, either because voters want to reward or to punish. And it's the first time, given the change in the electoral system, where you have 3 ballots and the potential to split the vote really might have some sort of consequence. So you engage, you can choose as a voter to engage in some kind of either strategic voting or values-based voting. So if you believe you want to be a values-based voter, you will say which of these parties accord with what my political outlook is, can I identify with them, and I will vote for them. And the 2 kinds of tactical or strategic voter who's thinking, I really love this party, I see them, but they performed badly, therefore I want to punish them and vote for someone else. Or I really want to come, and though I feel affinity, my values are represented in this party, but they behave so badly that the other guys are going to hold them to account, so I'd rather vote for them. And thirdly, I'm going to endorse another party purely on the basis of what its potential to deliver is. So the real opportunity to split a vote is there. I don't know if we'll see much of it happening, or we'll only know that after the result. But I think voters are catching on to the idea that there might be some space to play around with your voter loyalty and split the vote. Some perhaps not considering what the consequences might be post-election if you have different configurations of government at different levels, because you will have one which tries to be obstructionist, if there's a different flavor of government nationally as opposed to a province, as opposed to what might be in a major metro. So who knows what the turnout might be. But lastly, on this, and so this my final 2 points. First, on the question of tying back to the question of voter intention and whether they will want to endorse one party or not. And though we have disappointed everybody who wants to know what the outcome is going to be, they shouldn't be disappointed. There's only a week left and we'll know. So don't worry about that. The truth of the matter here is that it is impossible to know and I think to gauge what the voter intention is going to be, despite the indications of what closeness or affinity of voter loyalty might be in terms of people saying they feel close to one or other party, even amongst registered voters. Because they're either going to change their mind, or perhaps people were telling you something that they thought you might want to hear, which is obviously a problem in all surveys and survey method around the nature of the question which has been asked and so on. But on this question of intention, the likelihood, and it appears to me as if all of the polls are tracking that the ANC is tracking up. But I really wonder about the efficacy, not of this question particularly, because in between years, I think it does provide interesting insights into what voter attitudes are like. But I'm wondering about the profitability of knowing this now a week before the election. So if there's any one criticism to me, it's that. But it ties to a more important thing, and it ties to the question of closeness and affinity. And you showed that over time, that bond has broken, or there's a slightly greater distance between them. And that distance is unsurprising, as I say, because I'm unsure that voters know what particular political parties actually stand for anymore, given that the insular calculations and parochial calculations have always been merely about access to power. And the behavior in local councils, in coalitions, where people have got into bed with parties that they avowedly said they would never work with. It's unsurprising that voters can now no longer trust, which also explains why there are low levels of trust in political parties. So, I don't know as a voter what I'm standing for. What struck me, and this is my final point around coalitions, is I'm surprised that many people, given the experience of coalitions in South Africa so far at the local level in the big metros, I'm surprised the level of people, 28% only who disapprove. If you take the 3 who don't know and the 23 who are saying we're not sure, we don't have a firm view, as opposed to only 28% who definitively don't like it, 44% or so saying, yeah, it's okay, it's something we can go for. There's one more chance for parties to rehabilitate and behave reasonably appropriately with at least some fidelity to principles, to reestablish some degree of trust and therefore some degree of closeness. But I'm frankly surprised at what people's appetite for coalitions is. Of course, they know that it works elsewhere in the world. We don't know. And the parties have done the public a disservice by not stating upfront what kind of regulations they would like when it comes to coalitions. But nevertheless, I was struck by how many people are actually in favor of it. And with that, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me. I hope I haven't gone over time, which I promised I would not do. And I hope that it was reasonably coherent for someone who's not a political scientist.
And someone who we believe is a political scientist. Thank you so much, Ibrahim Fakir, for those very pertinent points and insights that you shared with us, and you did keep time. So for the next half an hour, we're going to engage with Jan and with Ibrahim. And so if you do have questions, I'm going to look at the Q&A bar. So please do go ahead. But in the meantime, I will open with a set of questions to Jan and to Ibrahim. So Jan, we'll start off with you. I mean, given that you pointed out that 1/3 of survey respondents said that they don't know which party they will vote for, what does the survey tell us about the generational differences, given that the youth have been such a huge focus during this election campaign? Do you have any insights you could share with us? Thank you.
Yes, Crystal. So with regard to young people, we have seen that they are more discerning, and which translates also particularly when we've asked them the question around loyalty. Their levels of loyalty to particular parties are far lower. So what we generally see, the trajectory is the older you are, the more sort of the levels of loyalty increase, and the younger you are, the less likely you are to have a close affinity to a particular political party. We've also seen that the affinity for the ANC mainly comes from the sort of the older generation of people, whereas a party like the EFF has got sort of particular sort of levels of loyalty amongst the youngest grouping that we have surveyed. In other words, those 18 to 25. So there is a distinct generational sort of schism in the way young people respond to questions of loyalty and affinity with parties. Krista, you are still on mute. So.
Thank you very much, Jan, for those insights. Ibrahim, I'm going to come to you now. I think firstly, agreeing with you that the survey really gives us insights into the voices of citizens, which I think with all the different polls that we've been inundated with, some accurate, really some not, it's really not given us voices of the citizens. So, Ibrahim, given the work that you do and your input, could you share with us some of the factors that you think are likely to influence voter turnout, based, of course, on the work that you do, but also the survey results?
Thanks, Crystal. I mean, sure, if I were able to have answered that question, I think I would have asked the IEC for a lot of money and then given them the secret for all of that, and then I would have not been here and been sailing a yacht somewhere. But alas, I'm not. So I mean, it's very difficult, but to predict. But like I say, I think there are two factors. A is if there's a belief or trust that institutions might start to function better. People might feel that there is time to reanimate and re-engage in the process. So that's the first thing around the question of institutions and politics actually serving the purpose that it's meant to, that is to channel and socialize and aggregate interest and then have them mediated at Parliament and then executed in the executive, right? But I don't think there's a genuine belief that those institutions play that role. So my first contingency is this, that if there's a reanimated belief that maybe post this election, because all the parties are catching a wake up, institutions might function better, let's go back and re-engage. That's one factor. The second factor is that, of course, there's a wider amount of choice. And there have been other work which has been done by other researchers like Colette Schultz-Herzenberg at Stellenbosch, who found that one of the drivers amongst voters and the lack of turnout is their belief that there isn't a lack of options. So I don't have that many options, or at least the options are not viable. I don't feel attracted to them. And so therefore I don't turn out. So that level of frustration with lack of options, I don't know if people believe that the new entrants this time, and there are many of them, 52, might actually serve that purpose, and that they do feel that there is an array of options available to them. The third is, and this relates to the findings around affinity to political parties, I think for this election, they might still feel hesitant and not turn out because the affinity is low. And the ideas around electoral reform, which could have reversed this, were thwarted. So people don't believe that, any kind of change, despite the promise of change in the electoral system, has come to pass. You're still pretty much dealing, though there is a change, you're pretty much dealing with the logic of the old system overall. And so that doesn't incentivize your ability to choose a type of politics which you feel might be closer to you, or a representative which is closer to you. So I'm not saying that's what voters are asking for, but I mean, I think they were looking at this process of reform and thinking, if there's a change, it might incentivize to behave and therefore incentivize the politicians to behave differently. But it doesn't seem as if it's done that. So last factor is because of that, those things might drive voter turnout down. But because there might be so much anger that they want to come out and either punish a party, it might cause that spike in voter turnout. I don't know. But I don't get the sense that that sense of anger has persisted in the way that I thought it would. I've sensed more rather a sense of frustration, and that frustration has led to a kind of withdrawal in the process. I think parties have keyed into that, and therefore this campaign has actually been relatively low key, if you ask me. It's not been a vigorous, energetic campaign. And I don't think that's really motivated voters. But those are the four factors I think will drive it, voter turnout. But my fear is that the last one will prevail, a sense of frustration and withdrawal. But I hope I'm happy to be wrong on this. You're muted, Crystal.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Ibrahim Fakir. Some comments from the audience. Professor Cheryl Africa is, of course, the director of IJR. Okay, maybe I must just put it to the side. Okay. Well done on the survey. I fully agree with Ibrahim regarding the conflation of democracy and governance. Dissatisfaction and lack of trust causes us to question the democratic gains that we have made. But it should not be an either-or situation. Dissatisfaction with the state of South Africa should not be conflated with democracy. Our democratic gains are extremely important, while elections are only one component of democracy. They allow us to judge our leaders' performance. At the same time, we need to be dealing with our socio-economic challenges. Having a good quality democracy and a good standard of living for all is not mutually exclusive. Given that comment from the Prof. Jan, the issues that South Africans are concerned about, and you gave us a list, but top 5, unemployment, crime, electricity, as you indicated, water as well. I mean, clearly South Africans are concerned about this. Do you want to talk us through some of those issues and also maybe add a point of Professor Cheryl's remarks?
Yes, I can certainly so do so. I think all of those are ones that we've seen repeated from one survey to the other. I think employment has been on top since we started doing the survey in 1999, and it is interesting that over the years we have not seen any progress in this regard. And I think this also then ties into the points that both Ibrahim and Prof. Hendricks has made, is that we cannot conflate governance, the substantive part, and democracy as a system where as citizens demand accountability, oversight, and also the ability to choose who we want to represent us as citizens. And I think if one just looks further abroad than South Africa, and we look at some of the other surveys that we have done across the continent, we see similar sentiments. People indicating that they're not happy with the way in which their democracies are functioning. But if you ask them about those particular trademarks of democracy, accountability, transparency, the ability to vote for the person that you believe can represent your interest base, the support is really high. And so it is not a case that such findings now indicate that South Africans or Africans in other countries have a preference for authoritarians. No, not at all. It rather means that they're just really unhappy with the way in which democracy has been functioning. And I found Ibrahim's point really poignant around the inability of parties to represent the interests of South Africans. And I think we have to ask ourselves why. I mean, is there sufficient accountability in our system? for parties, for officials, to ensure that they execute their mandate. In my opinion, we don't suffer a crisis of democracy or legitimacy of democracy. I think it's rather a question of accountability. Is the system working in a way that we don't only can vote people into power, but that we can also keep them accountable for what we have put them in place to do?
Thank you, Jan. A comment from Avril Harding. I'm not surprised that a high level of South Africans are in favor of coalitions. According to the IEC, there are currently 82 coalition municipalities operating in South Africa. Of the 82, only 32 coalitions are problematic, and it's those problem coalitions that are making the news. Consequently, 50 coalition municipalities are apparently operating seamlessly. So this issue, in my opinion, is that coalition negotiations should be conducted in a more structured and institutionalized manner. But of course, I think we'll have to wait until next week this time. Everybody wants you to look into your crystal ball, Ibrahim and Jan. But any particular comment on coalitions, given even I didn't know that there were 82 municipalities actually governed by coalitions?
Jan?
I think I'll sort of attempt to respond to that. Yes, I mean, it may also be firstly a function of or the responses that we received a function of people not having an experience of being governed in a coalition government context. These are also coalition governments at the local government level that Mr. Harding has spoken about. We have less exposure to coalition government on the provincial level, and if one excludes the government of national unity at the start of our democracy, almost no experience of coalition government at the national level. And so I think it may also be sort of a response as what can we provide as an alternative to what we have at the moment that clearly does not seem to be working for many people.
Thank you, Jan. Any comments, Ibrahim?
Thanks, Crystal. Thanks, Avril, and how's it? Yeah, there are these many coalitions, that's true, and some of them are not coalitions, they're kind of minority governments, but I mean, let's not get into those technicalities. But they do work, whether coalitions or minority governments, right? So it's a good question. Why is the focus on the big metros? Well, for one obvious reason. The reason why it's easier for some of the other coalitions to work so well, the ones that we don't really see or hear about, is because there's much less at stake. There aren't massive budgets, there isn't huge public procurement and contracting and so on, whereas in the metros, there is. So when it comes to the provinces and national, the same kind of imperative would start to apply. There's more influence to exercise, there's more authority to use, there's more public contracting, there's procurement, there's spending. So you want to, and the stakes are higher, so the fight becomes more vicious. Unlike it is in academia, where the stakes are low, but the fights are still vicious. In this case, there is a correlation between the viciousness of the fight and the vicious and the kind of strenuous resources available for distribution. You can have publicly negotiated, more structured coalition deals. That's all very useful, especially the more detailed the negotiations and the contract, the better. What happens when a party voluntarily doesn't want to abide by agreements that they've stuck? There's no sanctioning mechanism and so on. So, all of the regulatory stuff is up in the air, but moral suasion might be a good thing if this thing is negotiated publicly. But the short thing is, listen, coalitions can be terribly unstable the more the stakes are higher.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I mean, Jan, I'll just remind the audience your last point that you said. In conclusion, against this backdrop, it would be premature to make any precise prediction about a final election result, but a question from a journalist, Kristen Palitza. If the ANC loses its absolute majority, as is probable, what is this likely to mean for, one, the stability of the country, and two, the likelihood that the new government will make positive political economic changes, or is it likely to remain business as usual in South Africa for the next 5 years? And I will take liberty here, working for an international broadcaster, this is what they want to know. Even though as a South African, I know it's not possible to predict, but Jan, I'm not going to be an editor here and just cut the question, but over to you and Ibrahim for trying to answer this question from a journalist.
Oh, that is, how to answer a question like that. I think it depends whether one asks the question about economic stability and continuity, predictability about economic policy over time. And I think that there are various sort of permutations, as we know. I mean, it could be a left-leaning coalition, it could be a centrist coalition, it could be a coalition of the ANC and smaller parties. There may be no coalition at all, or maybe no need for a coalition at all. So each of those permutations may have different implications for the stability of economic policy. If one looks at what the so-called markets want, it is continuity and therefore I think a strong sort of ANC outcome. And I think for one that is going more center-right. And then there, of course, are the other permutations. I think in terms of economic stability, my personal guess, and it's just a personal opinion, not being borne out by any of the statistics that we have seen or presented today, is that there will be continuity over time. In terms of political stability, Ibrahim has earlier also referred to, I think, the very sort of robust democratic sort of architecture that we have. I mean, we have seen, as a result of state capture, some watering down of the competencies of those institutions, but generally they have been strong. If one compare them with some of our peers around the world. So I do not really foresee any political instability. There are questions that we've asked, for example, whether people would resort to violence, for example, when their particular party does not win, when they don't agree with the outcome, and the levels of agreement that has been very low. One does not know in what way parties may want to mobilize, whether they would want to be opportunist or not. I do see that as a very, very slim possibility.
Ibrahim, any response to the particular question asked?
Only echo, sorry, again, I can only echo what Jan is saying. We don't know the answer. The fact is the major metros are already under a coalition, that is Johannesburg, Pretoria, Nelson Mandela Bay, Ekurhuleni, a whole bunch, right? And the indications there are that it's not good. For example, Johannesburg had 8 mayors in 2 years. Of course, 2 of them were due to death, but 6, if you discount those 2, 6 in 2 years, it's like an average of a new mayor every 6 months. 3 months, sorry, 4 months. So, the change at the national level might not bring about that much instability as it might have brought in local municipalities. So by and large, the second feature is that if you're talking about economic policy specifically, what the posture would be is vastly different from what the institutions of economic management are going to be. So the Reserve Bank governor, if there's a change of government or coalitions, is not suddenly going to go. because the governor of the Reserve Bank is appointed through a different process, and a whole process will have to be followed to remove the governor, and that will take some time. The mandate of the Reserve Bank is not suddenly going to change, given that there's a new coalition. That again would take some time to change the mandate, right? So the Reserve Bank's not going anywhere, which means policy is tied to them around monetary policy, fiscal policy is not suddenly going to change. Treasury, even if there is a new government in place, is not for the foreseeable immediate future suddenly going to be changed with a new director general and so on, because the MTEF, the 3-year budgeting framework, is already put in place. So those things are less sort of worrisome than institutional stability overall. And there may be concerns, but we don't know. Suddenly, miraculously, parties might find some degree of maturity, and they start behaving differently. They incentivize to behave differently by voters. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen after the election. So anyone who wants to know about the stability, they can come and pay us high consultancy fees, and then we can tell them, we can write them a report.
Thank you, Ibrahim Fakir. Another question from Songezo Ndungane. I want to ask on the MK factor in the political scene. Has this implication for the opposition and its fragmentation? And can this be read along maintaining the ANC status quo?
I'll just try and respond based on some of the figures that we have, and I'm sure Ibrahim also has a couple of opinions on that. What we do see, and I think it was quite surprising for a new party, as I've also highlighted, is that they had to have no track record sort of in Parliament yet, but already sort of attract a degree of loyalty of people who say that they trust the party, that they have affinity with the party. This may also be due to the fact that its figurehead is somebody with a track record and a particular constituency that constituency trusts. So yes, I mean, what we do see sort of at the national level, the response, or tentative response that we got, about 10%. In the provinces, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, if we just look at them separately, the MK support is quite high. I mean, very close to that of the ANC in KZN.
Thanks, Jan. Fakir, any comments on this?
It's an untested party like a lot of the others. So I don't place that much store on them. But I mean, the thrust of the question for me is about fragmentation. The fragmentation is already in the system, and that fragmentation is enabled by this pure PR system in the way in which it functions. So if you talk about fragmentation, just look at the bottom 10% of the actual electorate and the composition of the current parliament. It's close to 9 or 10 different political parties, which represent a very minuscule number of voters. We made talk about even the local level, where you have a kind of mixed system, same kind of business, and it creates the arbitrage in the system for unscrupulous parties. For example, in Joburg, again, a party which represents less than 0.5% of the electorate actually has the position of the executive mayor. I mean, make this make sense in any kind of fair system. So fragmentation is already there. It's built into the system. The fragmentation is not led to a lot of diversity and inclusivity and inclusion. It has led to very little representation, very poor oversight, very poor accountability, because those parties produce nothing in terms of actually demanding a level of accountability from others. There are a few lone MPs, individuals who do, right? But by and large, they don't. The MK party is centered around, it's like a cult. I mean, if you talk about the MK party, can anyone identify who their premier candidate is in any of the provinces where they are contesting? So it's centered around an individual, and it's centered around certain political ideas. But those political ideas are less important than the political outcomes that they're seeking. The political outcomes they're seeking are about immunization from prosecution, protection from prosecution, and continued access to procurement and office and the benefits that come with office. So that's what the thing is based on. And whether, if you talk about this in relation to the ANC, well, you got to then talk about the ANC, the EFF, MK Party, the UDM, and another offshoot that comes out of the ANC. And then if you take all that ensemble together, if you take those different fragments, then the ANC at its root does better in the election than it does without them. The same is true for the DA, where you got to factor in the performance of Action SA, Bold One South Africa, all those other guys. So the fragmentation has not yet led to anything meaningful in terms of governance outcome. It's very diverse and representative, but the governance outcome actually quite poor.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Jan, I want to just touch on the fact that independence didn't feature a very not prominently, but positively by respondents. Is that because it's simply something new for us and that we're having this third ballot, or do you think there's something more that perhaps for the kind of next study could reveal potentially more?
Just for clarity, Crystal, what would be sort of good to know is just whether you're referring to the voter choice of independence or the sort of rejection of the idea to have independence stand. I think if it is the latter, I think it's very difficult to say because just in my day-to-day interaction with people around me, and even those that that are generally informed around political matters, I've sort of found out that many people did not know that we will have 3 ballots to vote for and what those ballots are for. So I think that may also do something to do with a degree of ignorance that exists around the the introduction of independence, both at the national and provincial level. So that can have something to do, and it might be something that we can only really probe in the next round of elections when those people have a track record or may have a track record that we can hold them to account.
Ibrahim, as we conclude in the next 5 minutes, any last remarks from you?
I'll just dwell for a moment on this sort of independence question. And there are not that many independents participating anyway. I think there's a total of 8 or 9 across the country. There's one who features prominently in the Western Cape. And the system, as Jan has said, is, and perhaps this is an interesting question, but again, we're at the mercy of our really actually quite terrible political parties. One would have said it would be interesting for Afrobarometer or even the Reconciliation Barometer to ask around attitudes or affinity or even knowledge of the current electoral system. And we don't know. But Jan is correct. Anecdotally, very few people know what the new system is, despite the minor tweaks. Those who do don't know about the third ballot, as Jan is saying, and they don't know what the different ballots mean. You have some explanations which are extremely technical and then lose the actual voter. So one would say, yeah, perhaps we should ask this question in future so we know what attitudes are to independence. But this system that we're using now has apparently got to be reviewed by the Act. Says that the minister has to establish a panel to review it. And what that panel comes up with would be fascinating. And perhaps that's something to test in the future round, depending when the system is settled on finally, right? But right now, I think if any independents do get elected, will probably only be a maximum of 2 or 3. Many don't even know those who are participating. There's one, as I say, standout candidate in the Western Cape, but that's about it. And the system, though, lastly, when we spoke about the affinity to political parties, perhaps if you change the system, you might have an affinity to political ideas rather than the parties, because I'm not sure people know what ideas the parties are actually standing for. So perhaps Afrobarometer and even the Reconciliation Barometer might want to ask certain questions around attitudes to certain political ideas. So this is going to be difficult and would require workshopping, but certainly I think it would be very useful and helpful to know. So it might even help to refine our political parties. I know they often use the opinion polls for planning, for deployment purposes, to know what's where, etc. Why don't they kind of use the interesting stuff that is done and that already exists by Afrobarometer to see what are people's attitudes to us? Frankly, despite the usefulness of this work, it's largely ignored, and that's really tragic. But I would say, well done again, Afrobarometer. It's been really useful for people like me who generate a lot of the kind of things we try to say on the basis of the work that you guys have done. So thanks a lot, and thanks, Crystal, for having me.
Thank you very much. As we conclude, just some housekeeping. Firstly, this will be uploaded on YouTube. It's already there on the Afrobarometer channel. And then presentation will also be uploaded to the Afrobarometer website after the conclusion of this webinar. And so thank you again, Jan Hofmeyer and the team at Afrobarometer and the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Really well done. I can't echo enough what Ibrahim has also said. Really, with 5 days to go before the election, I think this survey really gives us some substantive insights into what citizens think and feel ahead of this election. So thank you very much, Jan Hofmeyer from IJR, and of course, independent analyst and consultant at ASA, Ibrahim Fakir. Thank you so much.